Hi, I'm Latoya, and I've worked in services that support people affected by crime and trauma for over 20 years now. I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've picked up along the way. So, this recorded webinar will provide some information on trauma, how our bodies respond to trauma, and activities that can help you to cope. So, what is trauma? This word that I've used so many times already. Well, trauma is the effect of experiencing upsetting and or stressful events. It can be emotional or psychological trauma, such as post-traumatic stress disorder known as PTSD, is an outcome of situations or events that we as individuals find traumatic. Trauma is difficult to explain what the effects are on each individual because we all have our own individual experiences. But you may have experienced things like a low sense of self worth or self esteem, sexual difficulties, difficulties in maintaining trusted friendships and relationships. Some people experience depression and anxiety, and some people can develop substance misuse or even experience self harm. Some people have suicidal thoughts, and some others develop eating disorders. Some people can sometimes have feelings of isolation, and others have feelings of shame and guilt. Some people feel really betrayed or angry or have difficulties in finding trusting relationships. Some people experience nightmares or have trouble sleeping. You may have flashbacks from known or unknown triggers. Any of these could be signs or effects of trauma. And for you as the individual experiencing trauma, it can really feel overwhelming, like your thoughts are constantly ruminating and just bubbling up everywhere. When faced with a threat, our bodies goes into survival mode. It's hardwired to do this. During a traumatic event, you may have noticed your heart rate increasing, your breathing will increase to help your body pump more oxygen around it, and your body will produce and pump adrenaline and cortisol. Understanding the body really can actually help you to grasp what's happening and how to cope. So let's take a look. So now we've seen what happens in our hearts. Let's take a look at the brain. Our brains go into survival mode too. So what's happening? Well, the easiest way to explain this is to separate the brain into three parts. So let's start with the neurocortex. The neurocortex is at the top of our brain, and that's responsible for language, abstract thoughts, imagination, consciousness. It's where we get our reasoning from. Then we have in the middle the limbic system. Let's draw that in a bit closer. So the limbic system, this is the in the middle of the brain, and this part of our brain is responsible for emotions, memories, and habits. It's at this part of our brain that we make decisions. And then we have the brainstem and the cerebellum. So that's towards the back of the brain at the bottom. I'll just show you. Yeah, right there. So it's sometimes called the little brain. We share this with reptiles. This part of our brain is where we go into autopilot. So the cerebellum part of our brain will work without communicating with the top part, the neurocortex. The cerebellum will just act, and it acts on survival, it acts on instinct, it acts to protect. People sometimes say, "What was I thinking?" You wasn't thinking is the answer. Let's take a look why. So the cerebellum part of our brain, it gets to work without communicating with the neurocortex, that part of our brain that's responsible for reasoning. This absence of communication can often leave us feeling in total shock by our physical body response when we were in a traumatic situation. You see, our body will respond on autopilot. In traumatic situations, our brain responds with an involuntary survival response. Now, some people know it as fight or flight, but there's actually five of them. It's fight, flight, flop, friend, or freeze. And I'll talk you through that. So, fight, this is where we may physically fight, attack, hit, or punch in a traumatic situation. Then we have flight. Flight is where we might run away or we might hide. Then we have freeze. This is where we literally freeze, our body stiffens up and we're still, we're unable to move. Then we have flop. Flop's really similar to freeze. What happens is our brain shuts down and our body just flops, our limbs become really floppy. Then we have friend. Now, friend is when we might try to befriend the threat. We may negotiate, we may bribe or plead. All of these responses is our brain on autopilot. It's just our brain's way of trying to protect. So let's have a look at the limbic system. Now, remember, that's the part of our brain where we feel emotion, memory, and where we start to develop habits. This part of our brain, that will be lighting up if we're experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, or trouble sleeping. If you feel constantly unsafe, a sense of helplessness, or an involuntary physical response, this is our brain trying to protect us. And it does that even when we might be currently in a safe situation. Because you see, the brain isn't certain of whether we're actually experiencing something or if something is a thought. The problem with this is it leaves us feeling exactly the same way as we felt during the traumatic incident, where our bodies and our hearts start to pump really fast. Our experience in traumatic situations are as unique as us. As human beings, it's possible for us to be in the same traumatic situation, yet experience it totally different to one another. This is also the case for our brains. And it's how our brain and body will try to cope. And it's actually how we can learn to cope. Let's take panic attacks, for example. Now, you may be really familiar with panic attacks, or you may not be certain if you've had a panic attack. But so I'll explain panic attacks actually. So, a panic attack is an exaggerated, an exaggeration of the body's normal response to fear. Your heart starts to beat faster. You may have trouble breathing. You may even feel like you're going to faint. A panic attack can develop really quite quickly and it lasts anywhere between sort of 5 minutes to half an hour. It would usually reach its peak in about 10 minutes. Panic attacks will not harm you, it will pass. But they can feel extremely unpleasant and can happen at any time or anywhere. If this sounds familiar and like a familiar experience to you, you may have had a panic attack. Even though they come unexpectedly, and they are always triggered by something. So, one of the things that you could do is to get to know the signs and triggers. A trigger could be anything, it could be a smell, a sound, a place. For example, a sign that you may be about to experience a panic attack could be a change in your breathing. It may be that you feel physical pain in your body, or you start to feel really sort of tense. It may be that your mouth becomes dry, or you can feel palpitations. You might feel chest pains, or it could be that your stomach or your throat feel quite strange. The sign will be unique to you. If you have experienced a panic attack, and this is also useful for flashbacks, I've got an activity. So, in a moment, I want you to grab a pen, some paper, and make some notes, and you'll press pause. And this is what we'll do: sit comfortably and ask yourself these questions. What are some of the signs or triggers that you've noticed during a panic attack? And during the panic attack, where or who were you with? What were your thoughts at the time? And what did or could you have said to yourself that may or would have helped? Go ahead, press pause. Have you got it? Don't worry if you haven't. Now that you've asked yourself the question, you'll start to become far more aware of the sensations within your body before any panic attack starts. But I've got an idea, I've got a technique to share with you. Now, this is called mindful breathing. Take a look. Now, that video can be found in My Support Space. Just go ahead and type My Support Space into your search engine, or you can download it for free from your App Store. This is the end of part one for coping with trauma. I do have a part two where I share some more information and more strategies that you can use. You are really valuable. So take good care of yourself. See you soon.